Oh, hello, listeners. Just a note before we begin this week's episode. We love making Polity Matters, and we've enjoyed our first year so much. We're so glad to be in season 2, and we're going to continue to make Polity Matters as long as you keep listening to it, and, well, maybe even when you eventually stop. But it does cost a little bit for us to produce this podcast. We have some monthly costs, like hosting and recording. If Polity Matters has been a benefit to you, and honestly, even if it hasn't, would you consider helping us out? Go to buymeacoffee.com/politymatters. You can find the link in the show notes, and there you can donate, or you can get set up with the exclusive Polity Matters Blue Brick membership. We aren't trying to make a living off of this podcast, but we do need to cover some of our small monthly costs. Anything over our expenses will go to purchasing swag and maybe some giveaways across the course of the year. So we'd appreciate any support you can give us. Thanks so much. Be sure to stay tuned for exclusive offers that might come through that site, other ways that we may try to support some of our work. We want to make this valuable for you and give you as much as we can. Thanks so much for being a Polity Matters listener. We couldn't do this without you. Now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to Polity Matters. My name is Ben Ratliff, and I'm joined, as always, by Jared Nelson and Scott Edberg. For you listeners, it's only been a week since we were last with you in BCO Chapter 15. That began Season 2 of Polity Matters. But for us here recording, it's really like we're just getting back into it because we recorded BCO 15 back in the summer sometime, maybe even early summer. And now we're nearing the end of August as we sit before our computers in this very moment, and we're returning back to our regular schedule of recordings and BCO studying, and I'm curious how the guys are feeling. How's it feel back to be back in the saddle, gentlemen?
Like riding a bike. Right after running a marathon. My summer's been busy, so
yeah,
it's been exhausting.
I've enjoyed the extra free time, but it's probably better to actually do what my calendar says, which is record an episode of Polity Matters during this hour. And so I'm glad to be back on the saddle there.
We are we're back in the BCO. We've been all over the place over the summer talking to various Presbyterians, and chapter 16 really starts a new section of the BCO. You may remember all the way back to chapter 1, where the scriptural form of church government is said to be comprehended under 5 heads, and we've dealt with 4 of these 5 already: the church and its members, its officers, and courts. So those 4, and now we're coming into a section on the orders. And so what we're getting into is how are the officers qualified? How are they chosen? How are they ordained to the offices that they're called to? And so from chapter 16 through 24, that's really what we're tackling. 23 and 24 kind of trickling off there at the end. And so as we get into chapter 16, that's what you need to have in your mind, that we're dealing with now the officers that God has called, the orders of the offices, as it were. And so we have that in our head as we get into BCO 16:1. And unless the guys have something to add before we jump in, anything to keep in mind, we'll get right into it. Great. I love it. At the beginning of our show back, a year ago, the silence was deafening. I couldn't take it, but I'll take silence from you guys once in a while. If you just, I can work with that. Here's BCO 16:1. Ordinary vocation to office in the church is the calling of God by the Spirit through the inward testimony of a good conscience, the manifest approbation of God's people, and the concurring judgment of a lawful court of the church. So there's several things in here we need to break down, guys. First, it's probably good to ask the question and dive into this idea of vocation and church office. What is vocation, as the authors here talk about it?
Yeah, I think it's helpful just to define your terms. We typically try to define our terms on Polity Matters for some reason at the end of the episode, and so I tried to remind myself to define our terms perhaps a little earlier. When you're thinking of the idea of vocation in a worldly sense or in the general sense, it's a sense of calling towards a career or an employment, and so there's more than just having your day job. It's something that you yourself personally feel called to. In the church sense, it's kind of like that, but perhaps with a few more caveats. And it refers to your call to ordinary offices within the church, as Ben just read a moment ago, and it connects us then back to BCO 7:2 to define what those ordinary offices are, and those ordinary offices are elder and deacon. And so when you see the term ordinary there, it's just referring back to 7:2, where we get the definition of what are the ordinary offices within the church, which compares then to extraordinary offices, which were back in the early church with the apostolic ministry. And so extraordinary offices would be, or vocation would be the call of the apostles, and then ordinary vocation would be the call of elders and deacons.
Yeah, I think it's interesting here in the very first section, it seems like three different elements to this vocation. And those almost track with how I've heard it explained before. To really have a calling, it's not just you want to do it. There is an internal desire, but there's also an external affirmation of your gifts for that, as well as an opportunity for that. And I think that might be Os Guinness who first put his finger on that as those parts, at least, that has delineated those out. This almost seems to have that here, as it's talking about the inward testimony of a good conscience or something internal. I think of 1 Timothy 3, right? The aspiring to the office of overseer is a desire for a noble task, right? The desire needs to be there. So that internal sense of call has to be there. But that doesn't mean you're a pastor. And I think it's disastrous when you see people who say, I feel like I should be a pastor, therefore I'm a pastor now, and I'm just going to go plant a church, or I'm going to start a movement. That's how Joseph Smith gets started, just ordaining yourself is not a good idea. So you have these other two things that are here. There's the approbation of God's people, which almost seems to be like there's an opportunity and a need that's here as well. And then there's the judgment of a church that says, when we look at you, we see this. And so I've usually explained this as the external affirmation of your gifts is you might feel called to be a singer, but others don't feel called to listen to you sing. Both those things need to be there, as well as the opportunity. There has to be some sort of opening for you to use those gifts. You're not a freelance pastor or something like that. If you, in the 1700s, you said you felt the call to be an astronaut, well, there's no opportunity for you to fulfill that, right? So all of those things need to be here. And it seems like 16:1 has a bit of those elements in there. There's not only the internal desire, but there's the external recognition of those gifts by the courts of the church. And there's a need, a church court is asking you to come be their pastor in some form.
And we'll get into... Go on, Scott.
And so this just is the reminder that it's not merely a feeling, a personal feeling. When you're thinking of the idea of vocation, I feel called to this. There's a little more to it than that, as Jared was saying. And so in our individualistic culture, we tend to, it's all about me, myself, and I. If I think I'm called to do this, then I must be called. That's kind of how we rear our children, right? Like, oh, you want to be president of the United States? Well, go right ahead and be president of the United States. That may never actually happen and likely won't happen, but we allow our imaginations to wander to where if I think I'm called to something, it must be true. And that's not so in vocational ministry. There is a little more to it than that. If there is no desire for you to ever exercise what you think is your gifting in the local church, maybe you're not called. Maybe there's no opportunities because the Lord has not called you. And so it's a little more discerning. And I think it's helpful to think in these ways. Going to seminary with guys who were very close friends of mine, and they thought they were called, and opportunities didn't present themselves, and they went and did other sorts of ministries, not ordained ministry, because there are no opportunities for them in that venue, or they didn't have the gifting, or one of these three fell through, and they learned that in seminary. Some learned it after seminary, others before, but I think that structure is helpful when discerning your future in ministry. Do you have the gifting? Do you feel personally called? If you don't feel personally called, don't do it. Don't be prodded and forced into it. But also, do others think you should be in it? All helpful discerning questions.
Ramsey talks about it with the idea. He says the Holy Spirit produces the same conviction in the mind of the called, right? That feeling of personal calling, but also then he says in the mind of the people of God that have experienced the man's service, and also in the mind of the appropriate court. So there's a spiritual aspect to the calling, not just that you have the personal sense of calling by the Spirit, but then the Spirit is at work in those to validate that. And I'm just thinking through, we probably have some seminary students or interns in the PCA that are listening, and you'll experience this in a tangible way, and we'll get into this in a future chapter here before too much longer, that your internship process through the presbytery, your candidacy for ministry is going to involve these things. And so you may come to the presbytery and say you have a sense of call, and they're going to say, okay, well, we need your session to give us a recommendation that you be a candidate for ministry. And that's essentially your church that you've been with saying, yeah, we're pretty sure that he's ready to go, or he's at least got a call that needs to be pursued. And then you'll serve at some point in the midst of a church, and a court will come alongside you at the point of ordination, at least, certainly down the line, and do this concurring judgment. And so you'll begin to see all these things at play. We put these into practice in very tangible ways in the life of a young candidate. So
Yeah.
I have a question for you guys, though. So we talked about how this is a call to ordinary vocation. Just hypothetically, this obviously wouldn't happen in a Presbyterian church because we'd knock this down pretty quick. But what if a guy, says that he has a calling to be an apostle, right? But then he actually has a church that agrees, and maybe even something that looks like a church court agree with him. Does that mean that he's called to be an apostle?
He may be called to be some sort of an evangelist. I think about the guy that's in charge. I forget his name. I think Camden Busey in the OPC has a call to for Reform Forum and for that ministry. And so there might be things that are out of the ordinary, but not to take the extraordinary vocations of like apostle and prophet and say that those. I guess if they're extraordinary, that just means they come along occasionally. No, they're actually not for the New Testament church after the Book of Acts.
Yeah, Morton Smith said something that made me think of that. He said that the reason they say ordinary is because that's the only one available to us. There's no other options.
Yeah, so it's helpful not to think of this in terms of like out of bounds call, as not dealing with like the type of vocation or like the type of work that you're doing. This is dealing with what are you being ordained to? And so you might have a chaplain or someone who takes a call to Reform Forum that's maybe extraordinary in the sense of the type of work you're doing, but not in the vocational call that you're being ordained to. And so it's helpful perhaps also to distinguish between what we mean when we're saying that. It's not out of bounds. It's not being the stated clerk. That's not an extraordinary vocation.
Yes.
In the PCA, we're well known for having, what do we have, 2,000 churches, give or take? But we have like 5,500 teaching elders. I mean, some ridiculously offset number. Do y'all think that number, the amount of ordained teaching elders suggests that we're getting something wrong or missing something in this particular aspect of call? Are we ordaining men that don't have a sense, or that probably don't need the approbation of the court? Maybe y'all can pick up what I'm trying to put down, but we've got a lot of teaching elders. It seems like we ordain guys to a lot of different purposes, and maybe this drags along there with your out of bounds idea too. How does this all fit together?
Yeah, we have a couple guys in our presbytery that are professors in a Christian college and are ruling elders and serve in their church. And I asked one of them, because he very easily could be a teaching elder, but he didn't think that it was a teaching elder called position. And I think we just have some disagreement because there have been others in the past that have said that's a teaching elder called position. So some of that may be what is our attitude towards not just chaplains, but towards Christian institutions, Christian colleges, Christian secondary schools. Some of that is some of us have a little bit more of a broad idea of what a teaching elder does that's a little far afield of preaching on Sunday mornings and leading worship and pastoral counseling.
What's interesting when we were talking about that too is the qualifications of what's expected with ordained office, and when we define those things, the the administration of the sacraments are highly connected to that ordained calling, and I think it's not controversial to say that there are many men ordained in the BCA who have little connection to administering the sacraments, and that's probably part of the reason for the inflation of those ordained. It's perhaps a credentialism that we have that we participate in, where we love our credentials, and these guys are educated, and so we ordain them. But if you go back to like those defining chapters on what is expected for those who are ordained, we tend to broaden those at least to some capacity to include those who are not doing normal church things.
Perhaps when our the intern position became what we have as the assistant pastor position now, just to bring our favorite topic into the discussion, that certainly would have widened the responsibilities of somebody who was seeking ordination as a teaching elder, doing much more intern-looking things. We'll
that
ask
leads us to
Hoppers about
number
that
two,
sometimes.
right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, thanks. Good segue.
I'll segue you.
Usually I just on the cutting room floor, I segue straight into it and I just cut whatever we need to get in there. But BCO 16:2, the government of the church is by officers gifted to represent Christ, and the right of God's people to recognize by election to office those so gifted is inalienable. Therefore, no man can be placed over a church in any office without the election or at least the consent of that church. So there's really two things here going on, talking about how the church is governed, how the officers govern who they represent, and then the right of the people to recognize those officers. So maybe let's get into this first. Well, I'll just point it out maybe, and then we can talk about it. I've often heard that the Presbyterian Church is just like the United States government. We elect people to represent us on the session or on the diaconate or whatever it may be. But 16:2 is very clear. Officers represent Christ. Talk about it. It's a great point for us to highlight and spend time on.
Well, if you're ever debating the point, go to 16:2. It is a different mentality, though. You're not a representative of the people. You're a representative of Christ. In fact, that's the wording that we have in our BCO when you go to present communion, right? As a minister of Christ, as you're there representing him. So that's why these qualifications, it's not the qualifications of the congregation. They're the qualifications that are given to us by God in his word. That's what we're testing somebody's call. And we want to, when we're discerning whether this person should be installed there, yes, there's the congregation that has a role in that, but they're trying to ascertain, are they called by God to this church? And I think that's an important part of it, though, too. The election is still important by the congregation. Even if they are not representing them, they're representing Christ. I think the election is an important confirming of that call to the person, that in fact they are called to that. They're getting the opportunities here. We've seen some of those gifts. And so the election also by the presbytery, the affirming by the presbytery would be an important part of that too. But there's an important part of this that confirms the call, but the election itself is not the entirety of the call.
That's good. Yeah, there's a sense here that is declaring that we're a monarchy to a degree, under Christ as king. And Ramsey actually talks about it using the same language he used when he talked about 16:1, that the Holy Spirit calls the man to office, but then he also will call the people to elect him to that office. And so that's the representative aspect in terms of election, is that the people are joined in that process. What is significant, though? I mean, this has far-reaching implications. The right of a church to elect their own pastor or officers. So no man can be placed over a church in any office without the election or at least the consent of that church. The language of consent is certainly being used in reference to mission churches. That's where you'll see that most of the time. Maybe in some extenuating circumstances from a presbytery trying to oversee a church that's going through a closure or without a minister of some kind or without enough elders to constitute a session. But what is so important? Why is it significant for us to make this point?
Well, we've talked about this perhaps before about um, there's no divine appointment from a higher court on forcing someone to be your pastor. There's no established. It's not a bishop. Bishop Scott decides that priest Ratliff is going to be the pastor of Providence. That's not how it's intended to work. And so there's a work of you're not being placed over a church without any action of the congregation itself. This is something you might see in some capacity in Methodism or some other traditions, but I think they even in those traditions have a more laissez-faire approach. The congregation still typically has input, but it's not something like, oh, here's your candidate, now just approve them. There's a little more freedom in the congregation to choose those who rule over them, and we've talked about that extensively. I think the idea of consent, though, I think is a little broader than what Ben is saying. I think there's also the idea here that not everyone will vote for the man that is being elected. And despite your vote, if there's still a majority, that man will still be your elder. He'll still be your pastor. He'll still be your deacon. And you are consenting to submit to his authority despite your vote. Why? Because you're submitting to the brethren around you who've already voted, and they believe that God has called this man. It's probably really hard to conceptualize this in some capacity because we're so partisan in our mind. At least I am. Like I do enjoy politics, and so you're thinking like, well, that's not my guy. I didn't vote for him. He's not my guy. Not my president. Not my elder. But no, he is your elder, and part of 16-2 is saying here is that as a duly elected elder, you consent to his leadership, whether you voted for him or not, even if you voted against him or abstained or some other thing. And so it includes and encourages the full involvement of the congregation, including those perhaps who've had dissent.
I think there's some implications, though, here too, for certain things that happen that are the exception, such as usually we think of we are electing our elders, we have a session, but what happens when there are no elders that are available there, or you have a mission church and you have some sort of a interim session? That has implications for the congregation voting on that interim session too to come in. That they can't just be appointed by the presbytery with no input by the congregation. Almquist points that out in his forthcoming commentary that will be available from select retailers end of the year or beginning next year. Though it also has an implication, though, for I read this section, and again, our favorite topic, assistant pastors come in. Of course, assistant pastors don't serve on session, and this is the reason why the congregation has not assented to be ruled by them. I do think there's a bit of a tension here in that by teaching, by counseling, that's a form of rule, and I don't understand an elder that doesn't rule at all. So our church actually has had an assistant in the recent past, and I had a debate with my session about this, about should we call him as an associate or an assistant. I said associate. My session said assistant, and I submitted to them, but I said, can we have something of a compromise here where at the congregational meeting they will vote to affirm the decision of the session, because there is some sense that they're going to be submitting to his rule and teaching. And they said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And that's part of, I was trying to square this with, as is pointed out elsewhere, preliminary principle 6, BCO 1.4, 3.1, and here in 16.2, there's some sort of consent of the congregation that needs to be involved here for those that are pastoring on a regular basis of that congregation.
Jared, it sounds like to me you called an associate. It sounds like you had a ruse. And you just called him an assistant, but he was actually an associate.
Yeah, but they didn't have a search committee established in the proper way, so
that's no longer relevant.
You get twisty, though. I mean, no longer.
I think it was helpful to him, though, to have the congregation affirm that, they're going to be learning from him and, in a sense, submitting to his teaching, even if he's not going to have a voice on the session. Yeah.
Did he go to session meetings? I want to pry.
Occasionally, yeah.
Did he talk?
Occasionally, yeah.
He was an associate pastor.
Some assistants are given the privilege of the floor. You probably were when you were in Alabama.
Hey, I hear all the elements here. He was voted on by the congregation. He went to session meetings, and he talked. He just abstained from all those votes. I'm gonna have to try that. Thanks for the ruse advice.
Okay, all right, let's really get down to it. We can make this. We can decide what really was going on. How much was he paid? That'll help figure it out. All right, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good segue. Scott's been liking segues today. He probably wants me to move on to 16:3. Upon those whom God calls to bear office in his church, he bestows suitable gifts for the discharge of their various duties. And it is indispensable that besides possessing the necessary gifts and abilities, natural and acquired, everyone admitted to an office should be sound in the faith, and his life be according to godliness. Wherefore every candidate for office is to be approved by the court by which he is to be ordained. So only certain men can be ordained, and it's those upon whom Christ has bestowed suitable gifts. So let's talk about what these gifts are, and I mean, you know, there's different elements going on here. So first we see that they have to possess necessary gifts and abilities. So they should be able to, you know, learn the things they've got to learn. Come on, guys, help me out. I'm just rambling now.
Well, it feels like 1 Timothy 3, apt
Yeah.
to teach, or in Titus, I think it's can defend the faith, or something along those lines, right? Um, so there's the apt to teach part of it, but I'm glad that this also mentions godly life, not just sound in faith, because if you look at the qualifications, say in 1 Timothy 3, in 1 Timothy 3, you have 13 or 14 qualifications depending on how you count it, and all but one of those is character related. So there's both that he knows what he's teaching, but also that he doesn't have a Matthew 23 incident, you know, where Jesus has to tell them, look, the Pharisees, they're teaching you the word, and you need to listen to them, but they don't practice what they preach. So listen to what they say, but don't imitate their life. And for a good elder, they should be able to accept what you're teaching and imitate your life. Like Paul said, imitate me as I imitate Christ.
What do they mean when they talk about natural and acquired gifts and abilities? So we've got, you know, I mean, I'm asking a question I'm about to try to answer, I guess. I've heard Spurgeon recorded somewhere saying that, you know, you either are a preacher or you aren't a preacher. And you can't teach somebody who's not a preacher to be a better preacher, but you can improve on a man who is a preacher. If you guys could follow that. So that would be speaking to, you know, you've got to have natural but also acquired gifts and abilities. You need to be gifted by God to certain things that the ministry requires of you. And then you also need to seek to acquire, you know, learning and building and education on top of those things. Jared had a look on his face. I wondered if he was going to disagree with Spurgeon there, which is perfectly acceptable.
To some degree,
Yeah.
I think there may be times in which, and we've told somebody this as a presbytery before, you may be called to be a pastor or a preacher, but not right now. You don't seem to have those gifts right now, or you don't seem to have those characteristics present now. I went into seminary thinking I was going to teach, and I didn't want to preach because I didn't feel like I should tell anybody how to live their life. And until I had a conviction of I'm not, it's the word of God, and I'm just communicating the word of God, then I felt like okay, I think I actually do have a calling here, but it had to be from a conviction that came out. And so there's something can happen along the way in which you're called to that. And so I don't think we should tell people, well, you're not called to be a preacher, but we should maybe say right now. We don't see that right now.
Jared, don't tell people how to live their life. Come on, man.
Yeah, natural and acquired, you're thinking of things that are just natural giftings to you. Perhaps sometimes we close out ourselves in thinking things that don't come natural aren't worth endeavoring after. But there are things that we can learn and acquire even when we are not good at them at first. Someone might be a good reader, a great writer, a great speaker, but be deficient in woodworking, you know, and you can devote time to woodworking and become a better woodworker. Neuroplasticity is in the brain, and the brain can rewrite itself and relearn and learn other things better. And so sometimes, I mean, I've been guilty of this. I've looked at my past. I'm like, I'm not good at that, so I'm never going to invest any time into that. But we can acquire knowledge and abilities through hard work that we might not expect ourselves to be good at. A pastor might be like, I'm a terrible administrator. And so I'm never going to administrate. Well, you can become competent if you work towards that. and acquire it in study and effort. And so sometimes we sell ourselves short that we can only do what's natural to us. But it's a reminder that ministry is more than what's just natural to us as we grow as elders, our leaders in the church.
I think of Paul telling Timothy to do the work of an evangelist. And
Mhm.
Timothy wasn't called to that particular calling to be an evangelist, but that was part of what he was to do as a pastor. So it may not have been his primary calling, it may not have been his gifting, but Paul has to remind him, do this thing that you may not naturally be super great at because you'll grow in it.
Maybe just to finish this out and circle back around to the beginning of it. I love the first sentence of this paragraph in 16:3 that basically says, "Those whom God calls, He equips." If He's calling you to office, He will supply those things necessary. And so, I appreciate the words from my brothers there that there are hard things that we have to strive after, but the Lord is kind to supply what we need in our duties to which He's called us. We're going to get into 16:4. And this is a new paragraph as of the 50th General Assembly, so it's just a little bit over a year old. And there's not a lot of historical resources on it. We'll address it as we can, but you may want to search the internet. I'll try to have some links in the show notes. You may want to go back and look in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years where the debate on this matter was taking place. You're sure to find some interesting resources out there. But 16:4 reads, "Officers in the Presbyterian Church in America must be above reproach in their walk and Christ-like in their character. While office bearers will see spiritual perfection only in glory, they will continue in this life to confess and to mortify remaining sins in light of God's work of progressive sanctification. Therefore, to be qualified for office, they must affirm the sinfulness of fallen desires, the reality and hope of progressive sanctification, and be committed to the pursuit of Spirit-empowered victory over their sinful temptations, inclinations, and actions." Like we said, this was an overture to the 49th GA. It was ratified by the presbyteries that year and approved and adopted at the 50th General Assembly in Memphis. Scott's got an article from PCA Polity back in the day. There's probably some things earlier than that I'll sort out and find and stick in here for you guys. But does one of y'all want to give us kind of the historical aspect of this? What brought about this particular paragraph? If any of our listeners were not around or not paying attention. It's not that touchy. Come on, guys. Dead silence. Really? I'm leaving all this in. You guys think I'm going to edit it out. I will not.
This comes, of course, after all of the controversy that had happened around Revoice and around debates over how we understand sexual sin. And is sexual sin something that's primarily we're talking about acting on something, or does it go deeper? Does it go to temptations and inclinations? And how do we talk about ourselves that way? And how do we understand those desires, even down to sinful? Do we just mean they come from a sinful place if they're acted on, or do we mean the actual desires are sinful? And I think there was a lot of reflection that was done on an area that almost nobody knew the word before of concupiscence. Is that the word I'm looking for?
Yeah,
Great.
you said
Yeah,
it
that's
properly too. Yeah.
Okay. And the idea of, is the desire itself sinful? And what do we do with that? And we seem to go back and forth between, hey, we're going to be, nobody is perfect, and so we can't be nitpicky on this, to, well, should somebody have a complete victory over many of these things? And I think this provision actually benefits from a long period of trying to hammer this out, to say, how do we say what a minister needs to be working on and at with his fight in his sinful desires, whether they be sexual or whether they be in other areas of greed or over power or different lusts that may be in our hearts. And settled, it seems, on this, these things are presents that they can identify and say, these are sinful. These are not good desires for sinful things. Number two, that there's a hope of progressive sanctification, that there's no area that you can cord off and say, the Holy Spirit can't change that. It can't touch that. And to say, because I give it a new title, maybe I say it's orientation, I'm just greedfully oriented, and that's just who I am. Or if somebody says that they're oriented sexually in some way and the Holy Spirit can't touch that, That's not proper. There's progressive sanctification in all areas of life, and then that they're pursuing victory, which means that they'll probably have different battles in which they are having victory in, but the war keeps raging because they're pursuing it. They haven't necessarily arrived at it. And so this actually helps us to say, of those 13 or 14 qualifications, and that all but one were about character, we probably need to focus more on character and be thinking about it and encouraging ministers to pursue character improvement. When you get your degree or your certification that you've been ordained, that doesn't say I've aced that, I'm done with the character part, and I'm moving on. It's a continued growth that you're in. And so 16.4, I think, helps us to, instead of having a BCO that is just focused on apt to teach, that the other areas really need to be a focus for the courts of the church and for those that are pursuing ordination.
Yeah, when you're reading this paragraph, it kind of sticks out oddly after we've just read through all of 16, where chapter 16 is very general, very, very big picture. And then when you get to 16.4, it's like you go from something that's very wide to something very narrow and focused. And perhaps that, like as I'm reading through 16, when you get to 16.4, you can almost see the controversy. There had to have been something. Like the only reason something like this would exist in this section with this like specificity is for a controversy to make it appear. And I think that's kind of how 16-4 fits into 16. It's you can by just reading it, you can see that this is a response to something, not something that was organically welled up within the actual chapter. It's kind of like if you've ever been on an interview and they ask you this weird, odd question. It's like, do you like listening to loud music, or do you have how many speeding tickets? So like, why are you asking me that? Well, you're probably asking me that because of something that happened with a previous minister that always blared heavy metal music as he was leaving the church parking lot, or almost killed the kids because he was driving the van too fast. That's kind of this section, 16-4, where it's like there's something that happened. And this was the remedy that we came up with to help alleviate that.
Great. Well, I thought we might end. I didn't tell you guys about this ahead of time, but I'll give you a minute to think. What resources come to your minds if you are being asked by a young man or even a man in your church who's thinking about office? If someone's trying to discern a call to ministry as a teaching elder, a ruling elder, or a deacon, what are you going to hand them? Where are you going to point them? Obviously, the pastoral epistles in the New Testament are great. The one that I was given when I was coming up was Ed Clowney's Call to the Ministry. The new cover is a disaster. It really needs to go back to the old kind of like teal with the fish on the front and the net, but that's okay. Richard Baxter's The Reformed Pastor is a good one to pick up if you want to read through some of these things. What else comes to y'all's mind that would be helpful for some of our guys?
If you're talking particularly about the idea of a call, there is, of course, Os Guinness, The Call would be a good resource or something to help you think about it. My favorite book on the Christian ministry, though, has always been Charles Bridges, The Christian Ministry. And Charles Bridges was a friend in ministry to J.C. Ryle in the Church of England. But his work, there's maybe just a couple places that are a bit dated where he's talking about English culture, but most of it is just so good in terms of thinking through, especially character-related matters, and then getting to a point where you're thinking about how do I communicate the gospel. So I would say if you're thinking about going into the ministry, The Christian Ministry by Charles Bridges is something you need to read.
I don't know if this is a resource that's available, but when I was in my undergrad at Moody Bible Institute, one of the first classes they forced pastors to take, or future pastors to take, was Introduction to Pastoral Theology. And the whole purpose of the class was to like deconstruct your presuppositions about pastoral ministry and reconstruct an accurate view. And I remember Dr. Kessler saying in one of his first classes that being a pastor is not glamorous. You might think of yourself as, oh, you're going to pastor this huge church of faceless people, and it's going to be just the most delightful thing in your life. But he said that actuality is that you're like a farmhand that's just meant to shovel manure all day. And maybe that's a little too real in some regards, but some sort of educational class about what is true ministry and the expectation for ministry. I don't know if RTS has a class like that on their website or if Moody Bible Institute recorded that class. It'd be a great asset to perhaps better focus in on what is actual ministry outside of the glamour, outside of the limelight, what is expected. All those books that Ben required or recommended to you are required readings for that class, and that's what made me think of it.
Well, I appreciate y'all's recommendations, and I appreciate Scott contributing the title of our episode. Thank you, brother.
What was that?
Something about manure. I'll go find it later. Don't know for sure, but it's there. As a lawful court of the church would say, this podcast is over. Thank you for joining us. If you're interested in learning more about anything that we've mentioned, check out the show notes in your podcast player, or you can go find those at politymatters.org. As a reminder, you can go to that website URL and find a list of all of our previous episodes, and if you click on any of those, you'll find our show notes if there were any for each episode. So if there's a resource we've mentioned, if there's something you need to go back and find, you can go search there. You can also email us if you have questions or comments. If you're looking for something that we've talked about you can't remember, by sending us an email at politymattersfeedback@gmail.com. And we're all on Twitter as well. You can check the show notes for those links. If you've enjoyed this show, do consider following us on Twitter or Facebook at Polity Matters, and be sure to subscribe to the show in your podcast app of choice. We're excited to be in the throes of Season 2. I don't think any of us ever thought we'd get past Episode 1, and here we are. So thank you so much for your support, your encouragement. It's been a fun time, and we're excited to keep cruising through the Blue Brick. So thanks for spending your time with us. Until next time, say goodbye, gentlemen.
Bye, gentlemen.
Adios.
Y'all take care.